So in this video, I'm going to talk about what happens in the United States during the war. This is typically, want to remember when we talk about wars in this class, the heavy emphasis is on what happens to government and society during the war in the United States. So please keep that in mind that these are big, and important ideas. Okay, so the success of U.S. and allied armed forces depended upon mobilizing America's people, industries, and creative and scientific communities. The role of federal government expanded well beyond anything in World War I or the New Deal. As in World War I, the U.S. government organized a number of special agencies to mobilize U.S. economic and military resources for this wartime crisis. Early in 1942, the War Production Board, WPB, was established to manage war industries. Later, the Office of War Mobilization set production priorities and controlled raw materials. The government used also a cost-plus system in which it paid war contractors the cost of production plus a certain percentage of the profit, thereby incentivizing a higher output. One federal agency, the Office of Price Administration, regulated almost every aspect of civilian lives by freezing prices, wages, and rents, and rationing such commodities as meat, sugar, gasoline, and also tires, primarily to fight wartime inflation. Deficit spending during the Depression was dwarfed by the deficits incurred during the war. Federal spending increased 1,000% between 1939 and 1945. As a result, the gross national product grew by 15% or more a year. World War II proved what the New Deal did not, that the government could in fact spend its way out of a depression. By war's end, the national debt had reached the then staggering figure of $250 billion, 5 times what it had been in 1941. Just as an aside, I put our current debt as of a few days ago when I made this presentation. We are at $19 trillion. You can check out that website below. There's a lot of, it's not visually or aesthetically pleasing, but there's a ton of information on the economy there. I don't know. I find it fascinating. Anyway, moving on, the U.S. government expands power, spends money when they are in a deficit, and produces more than they ever have before. Here's an example of the ration cards. These are ration cards that were available during World War II. You would not only have to pay for the price of the good, like a pound of sugar, but you'd also have to pay, let's say, like 1 or 2 stamps. And there were different types of stamps on them. Of course, there became a very lucrative black market for ration books as well, but that's just a little aside. Stimulated by wartime demand and government contracts, U.S. industries did a booming business, far exceeding their production and profits of the 1920s, which, remember, was a pretty solid year for industry, or decade for industry. So they're even better, they're doing even better than they were in the 1920s. The Depression was over, vanquished at last by the coming of war, and by 1944, unemployment had practically disappeared. War-related industrial output in the U.S. was astonishing. By 1944, it was twice that of all the Axis powers combined. Instead of automobiles, Tanks and fighter planes were rolled off of the assembly lines. American factories produced over 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks and ships with a total 100,000 tanks and ships with a total capacity of 53 million tons. So efficient were production methods that Henry Kaiser's giant shipyard in California could turn out a new ship in just 14 days. The war concentrated production on the largest corporations, so the smaller businesses lost out on government contracts to larger businesses that had a greater ability to produce more. The 100 largest corporations accounted for up to 70% of wartime manufacturing. So these big businesses are becoming even wealthier because of these government-funded contracts. Government worked closely not only with industries, but also universities and research labs to create and improve technology that could be used to defeat the enemy. The Office of Research and Development was established to contract scientists and universities to help in the development of electronics such as radar and sonar, jet engines, rockets, medicines such as penicillin, which, by the way, you will hopefully remember that penicillin was already established. I believe it was 1928, but the United States needed a lot more penicillin to deal with the casualties and of war. The United States funded research to help make that possible. The United States also funded the top secret, extremely top secret, so top secret that FDR's vice president didn't even know about it, Manhattan Project. And this was when scientists worked towards the creation of the world's first atomic bomb. I'll talk more about that in another episode, and we will definitely discuss this in class. Ironically, many of the European scientists that had to flee fascist persecution end up contributing to its defeat by working in the United States. Labor unions and large corporations agreed that while the war lasted, there would be no strikes. So I just want to kind of put this as, or remind you that in every war that the United States has had, there's always been a large opposition to U.S. involvement in that war. But we tend to forget that because America tends to look at World War II as kind of the great American standard. It was the greatest generation, the generation that had to deal with the Depression, the generation that had to combat fascism and protect democracy, and make a great amount of sacrifices. But that's actually the exception and not the rule. So it's important to keep that in mind, that this kind of World War II, is particularly after Pearl Harbor, tended to unify the country during wartime in a way that had not really happened before and has not happened since. That's not to say that opposition did not exist in World War II, but that it was on a lot smaller scale than it was in even World War I. Okay, so that being said, back to labor unions and workers. Workers, though, became disgruntled when their wages were frozen while larger corporations were making huge profits. John L. Lewis, who hopefully you will recall from earlier readings, therefore called a few strikes on coal unions, or of coal unions. The Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act of 1943, which was passed over Roosevelt's veto, empowered the government to take over war-related businesses whose operations were threatened by a strike. So anything that might impede war production, this piece of legislation gave the government the right to take over that industry. And remember that most industries now are focused on war production. So this piece of legislation granted very broad powers to the federal government. In 1944, Roosevelt used this law when he ordered the Army to operate the nation's railroads for a brief period of time. The government paid for its huge increase in spending, which it spent $100 billion in 1945 alone, just on the war, by doing two things. One, increasing the income tax, and two, selling war bonds. For the first time, most Americans were required to pay an income tax. In 1944, the practice was begun of automatically deducting a withholding tax from paychecks. So this still happens if you were to receive a paycheck in the United States and most countries now, but in the United States, that paycheck is going to be significantly less than what you think it is because taxes are just automatically taken out of that paycheck. So this happens, or this policy is established during World War II. Borrowing money by selling $135 billion in war bonds helped to supplement the tax increase. And these war bonds were sold by celebrities. They would have, these entertainment events where you could come and meet some of the American heroes that we talked about in the 1920s, or some movie stars, or even some war heroes, as a way to kind of generate sales of war bonds or war stamps. If you couldn't afford an entire bond, you could still contribute to the war effort by giving small amounts of money. In addition, the short age of consumer goods made it easier for Americans to save. So people weren't purchasing as much. The consumerism of the 1920s was severely halted by the economic depression, and then did not pick up again because of the war effort. Few people opposed the war, so the government propaganda campaign of posters, songs, and news bulletins was primarily focused on maintaining public morale and to encourage people to conserve resources and to increase war production. The Office of War Information controlled news about troop movements and battles. Movies, radio, and popular music all supported and reflected a cheerful, patriotic view of the war. The unity of Americans behind the war's democratic ideals helped that generation remember it as a good war. Again, this America, pro-democracy, trying to save the world from fascism, from terror, from genocide and atrocity. And here you have two examples of two very small examples from a large pool of propaganda that comes out during the war years. One showing this big threat of Japan and Germany, and another talking about basically making sure that you are not being careless about government secrets or troop movements or whatnot, that you're being aware because there could be spies and they could overhear you and you could jeopardize somebody's child. That flag that you see hanging in the background behind that very sad dog laying on a uniform became popular during World War II. And it was something that was flown or hung outside of doors or in windows, and a star would represent a son that was at war, that was fighting in the war. So this flag, you can tell that this family has one son fighting the war. Of course, it was not uncommon to have families with multiple sons fighting the war, and therefore you would see multiple stars on that flag. Every group in the U.S. adjusted to the unique circumstances of wartime. The increase in factory jobs caused millions to leave rural areas for industrial jobs in the Midwest and on the Pacific Coast, especially California. Entirely new communities arose around the construction of new factories and military bases. So many of the new defense installations were located in the South because of the region's warm climate and also low labor costs. The wartime expansion set the stage for a post-war migration to the Sun Belt. And if you are not familiar with what the Sun Belt is, it is the southern region of the United States from East Coast to West Coast. So we're going to see another migration of people because of the war industries and their locations during World War II. Attracted by jobs in the North and the West, over 1.5 million Americans left the South. In addition, 1 million young men left home to serve in the armed forces. Some of the most famous units, and these were segregated units at the time, and some of these famous units were the Tuskegee Airmen, or the 761st Tank Battalion, where soon-to-be famous baseball player Jackie Robinson served. Whether as soldiers or civilians, African Americans continue to face discrimination and segregation. White resentment in urban areas led to dozens dying in race riots in New York and Detroit during the summer of 1943. Again, as African Americans were pitted against other low-wage earners and also competed for jobs and for housing in cities, it caused this increase of tension among different groups, usually among others that are minoritized in society as well, unfortunately. During World War II, membership in the NAACP increases. Also, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, was formed in 1942 to organize efforts to increase focus on African American civil liberties. CORE will become one of the top civil rights organizations, along with the NAACP, during the movement in the 1950s and 1960s. And speaking of the soon-to-come civil rights movement, I tend to trace its origins back to a man named A. Philip Randolph and his March on Washington. Randolph threatened to have 50,000 African Americans march on the city in protest to increase discrimination in war industries and the military. The march was canceled, though, after FDR issued Executive Order 8802, or the Fair Employment Act, which banned discrimination in war industries. So African Americans would not be kept out of working in these factory jobs. It did not, however, desegregate the military. That will not happen until shortly after World War II under President Truman, or then President Truman. One judicial victory was achieved in the Supreme Court case of Smith v. Albright, which ruled that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans as a way of excluding them from voting in primaries. So usually you have to be, or at least at that time, in some states it's different now, but you have to be registered for a particular party in order to vote in that primary. So say if I wanted to vote for Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Kasich, I would need to be a registered Republican in order to do that. I could not vote in a Republican primary if I was a registered Democrat or if I was registered as independent. Now, what this court case does, Smith v. Albright, is that it keeps political parties from banning African Americans, a practice that was done particularly to try to keep out African American interests in political candidates. Many Mexican Americans worked in defense industries, and over 300,000 served in the military. In 1942, the United States had an agreement with Mexico, which allowed Mexican farm workers, known as braceros, to enter the United States in the harvest season without going through formal immigration procedures. So it made it easier for Mexicans to come to the United States to work farms so production could increase. The sudden influx of Mexican immigrants into Los Angeles stirred white resentment and led to what are called the Zoot Suit riots in the summer of 1943. The Zoot Suit riots were a series of racial attacks that during a period when many migrants arrived for the defense effort and newly assigned servicemen flooded the city. So what happens is you have a collection of United States sailors and Marines attacked Mexican youths recognizable by their zoot suits, and they were also usually called unpatriotic as well. Here's a picture of the zoot suit. One of the reasons they were referred to as unpatriotic was because the United States also had a ration on material or cloth that you would use, and as you can see, the zoot suit uses an excessive amount, or what would be considered an excessive amount of material as in creating this suit. And so these were clashes between American military members and mainly teenagers, but also other members of the Mexican and Mexican American community. Oh, I do want to just point out also that the people that were arrested and charged in these Zoot Suit riots were not the participating service members, but the Mexican and Mexican Americans. American Indians also contributed to the war effort. Approximately 25,000 served in the military, and thousands more worked in defense industries. One of the most famous units or famous Native American contributions to the war would be the Navajo Code Talkers, which was a unit that used the Navajo language as a way of transmitting information, as it was a language that was not commonly understood by the Axis. Having discovered the opportunities off their reservations, more than half never return. More than any other group, though, Japanese Americans suffered from their association with a wartime enemy. So the majority of people that are receiving distaste in America, to put it lightly, it's not Germans and Italians, but not to the extent as it was the Japanese. Almost 20,000 native-born Japanese Americans served loyally in the military. Nevertheless, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were suspected of being potential spies and saboteurs, and a Japanese invasion of the West Coast was considered imminent by many. In 1942, irrational fears as well as racism prompted the U.S. government to order over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to leave their homes and reside in the barracks of internment camps. Japanese Americans living in other parts of the U.S., including Hawaii, did not come under this order. And this was passed by FDR as an executive order number 9066. I also do want to point out that the majority of people that were moved into these internment camps were American citizens born in the United States. Okay. This decision was upheld in the famous Supreme Court case Korematsu v. U.S. in 1944. The Supreme Court said that the government's use of internment was justified in wartime. It wasn't until 1988, years later, that the federal government agreed that the ruling was unjust and awarded a financial compensation to those still alive who had been interned. Because I do want to point out, when people were taken or when people were forced into these internment camps, okay, they weren't allowed to take all of their property with them. They weren't allowed to, and the law, unfortunately, when they were let out, did not protect the property of Japanese and Japanese American citizens. So it was very likely that while people were interned, that somebody took over their business, somebody moved into their house, somebody took their goods. And so not only did people have to suffer the atrocities of this internment, but they come back and they do not have anything. So there continued this kind of continued policy of racism. There was by the way, there has been no evidence to show that there were Japanese spies or that any of the people interned were colluding with the Japanese government. The war also changed the lives of women, as usually happens during any war in the United States. Over 20,000 women served in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Marines. So there were actually female units during World War II of these service branches. They were non-combatant roles, but they were military roles nonetheless. And then, as in World War I, a labor shortage caused the women to take jobs vacated by men in uniform. 5 million women entered the workforce, many of them working in industrial jobs in the shipyards and defense plants. The number of married women in the workforce increased to 24%. Here you can see the popular propaganda poster of Rosie the Riveter, who was a fictional character created as a empowering call to women to serve their country. However, even though women are working alongside men, or they are working in jobs that were originally occupied by men, they still received pay that was well below that of their male factory workers. The war consuming most of people's attention during this. The war consumed most people's attention during this time, and the presidential election of 1944 held less interest to the American public than usual. Many felt that in this time of emergency, that there should be no change in leadership, that it would be bad for America if we were to shift presidents in the middle of war. The president therefore sought and received the Democratic nomination for the 4th time. There was a change, however, in the Democrats' choice of vice presidential running mate. Party leaders felt that Roosevelt's third-term vice president, Henry Wallace, was too radical for his calls of rapid desegregation and his policies that tended to be soft on the Soviet Union. With Roosevelt's agreement, they replaced Wallace with Harry S. Truman, a Missouri senator with a national reputation for having conducted a much publicized investigation of war spending. Although Roosevelt publicly denied medical problems, those near him recognized his uncertain health. The Republicans nominated the 42-year-old governor of New York, Thomas Dewey, who had a strong record of prosecuting corruption and racketeering. The Republican candidate, though, was unable to offer any real alternatives to Roosevelt's leadership or generate really any enthusiasm for change. Basically, America thought, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Winning 53% of the popular vote and an overwhelming 432 to 99 votes in the Electoral College, the president was elected to an unprecedented 4th term. He will be the only president to serve 4 terms because after that we get a constitutional amendment. As it proved, however, FDR lived for less than 3 months after his inauguration. So most of his term is going to be served by Harry Truman. And that will be an interesting point of discussion when we talk next class about Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. So stay tuned. Last video that's coming at your way is a discussion very briefly on war strategy, but particularly wartime diplomacy within the Allied powers. So more on that.